$31,400, Julian, in 3 weeks.
It's family money, Dad. Relax.
It stopped being funny the day you stopped asking what it cost me.
He never gave me $1, so I built something he could never take credit for. By the time Harold Bennett finally saw the difference between the son he'd chosen and the daughter he'd overlooked, it was almost too late to matter. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure you're subscribed, because this family is about to learn the difference between the child you spoil and the child who actually earns it. Harold Bennett built Bennett Industries out of a single leased warehouse in Atlanta in 1991. 32 years later, it was a logistics and import company worth more than he'd ever let himself say out loud at the dinner table. Because in his house, money was something you built quietly and protected fiercely. He had 4 children. 3 daughters who never once asked him for anything they hadn't already worked for: Vivian, Renata, and Adrian, and 1 son, Julian, who had never once had to. Harold would deny, if you asked him directly, that he had a favorite. But everyone in that family knew the truth, the way you know a draft is coming from somewhere in an old house, even before you feel it on your skin. Julian got the car at 17. Julian got the corner office at 24, 2 years out of a business degree he'd barely finished. Julian got the benefit of every doubt Harold had ever owned. His daughters got report cards nobody looked at closely enough, recitals nobody made it to on time, and the quiet, private understanding that in the Bennett family, ambition wasn't something you were handed, it was something you built for yourself in the space Harold left over after Julian. Harold hadn't always been a man rich enough to overlook anyone. He remembered, though he rarely let himself, the year he'd nearly lost the warehouse lease because a shipment came in 3 weeks late and a client walked. He remembered sleeping 4 hours a night for the better part of a decade, Loretta running the books from their kitchen table with a baby on her hip, both of them too tired most nights to notice which of their children had had a good day and which one hadn't. Somewhere in those exhausting years, a pattern had set itself without either of them choosing it on purpose. Julian, the only son, became the one Harold pictured when he pictured the company's future, and the habit calcified long before either parent thought to question it. Vivian had been 7 the first time she noticed. Harold had missed her school recital for a client dinner, and when he got home past her bedtime, he'd gone straight to Julian's room to see the science fair ribbon their son hadn't even placed first with, and never once asked how Vivian's recital had gone. She hadn't said anything. She'd learned, even that young, that saying something rarely changed the outcome. It just made the disappointment visible, and visible disappointment was its own kind of burden to carry in a house that already had enough of them. Julian walked into the kitchen that Tuesday already sensing something was wrong, catching the way everyone's eyes landed on him the second he sat down. Harold slid a printed bank statement across the table without a word and let the number speak first. $31,400 spent in 3 weeks. Julian didn't deny it. He said they'd been celebrating life, success, just enjoying themselves, as if that alone explained the number away. When Harold asked what exactly there was to celebrate at that price, Julian's voice climbed into something closer to offense than apology, the tone of a man who had never once had to defend himself and resented being asked to start now. He reminded his father that it was family money, that Harold himself had always said everything he owned would become Julian's one day: the company, the houses, the cars, so why was he acting surprised now? Harold told him, quietly, that he'd expected Julian to protect what he'd built, not treat it like it refilled itself on its own. Julian waved that off too. It was only money, he said. They'd make more, and Harold reminded him, just as quietly, that money didn't appear by magic, that people worked and sacrificed for every dollar, and every dollar spent ought to have a reason behind it. Julian's only answer was that they'd had a good night, and that should be reason enough. Harold didn't raise his voice. He simply told his son that until further notice, no company expense would be authorized without his direct approval, and Julian left the table without another word, more insulted than chastened. Harold sat alone at that table a long time afterward, staring at a number that represented to him something much larger than $31,000. The first real crack in a story he'd been telling himself for a decade, that he'd raised a son who understood what all of this had actually cost him. If you already know exactly which sibling in your own family got the benefit of every doubt, drop a like, you're not alone. Vivian Bennett hadn't waited for her father's benefit of every mistake he'd let Julian make instead of hers. She'd built her own future instead. She'd left Atlanta for New York 11 years earlier with 2 suitcases and a business plan nobody in her family had asked to see. And she'd spent every one of those 11 years proving quietly and without an audience, that she didn't need Harold's company to build something that mattered. Those first years had nearly broken her. She remembered sleeping on a fold-out couch in a shared apartment in Queens, working a marketing job by day and building her import business by night, entering supplier negotiations in the only blazer she owned, dry cleaned so many times the fabric had gone thin at the elbows. She remembered a bank rejecting her loan application 3 times before a fourth, smaller lender finally took a chance on her, not because the numbers had changed, but because she'd finally learned to stop apologizing for asking. She never called her father during those years to ask for a dime, not once. Even the month she genuinely didn't know if she'd make rent. Some stubborn, wounded part of her had decided a long time ago that she would rather fail entirely on her own terms than succeed on borrowed permission from a man who'd never once offered it freely. Her import and logistics firm, smaller than Bennett Industries, but growing faster than anyone had predicted, had just landed the kind of investor meeting most founders waited a decade for. The lead investor complimented her confidence, told her she'd spoken with real conviction rather than just ambition, and asked whether she'd considered expanding further into international markets. Vivian told him yes, that her next chapter had always meant reaching further into Africa specifically, and that the timing simply had to be right. When he asked what progress meant to her, she told him it wasn't growth alone that mattered, but how many people moved forward alongside her. The lead investor, a woman close to Loretta's age, lingered after the others had filed out and asked, almost gently, whether Vivian's family's company, Bennett Industries, back in Atlanta was any relation. Vivian kept her voice even and told her it was her father's company. The woman remarked that it was interesting she'd built her own instead of joining his, and Vivian answered simply that she'd wanted to know she could. The older woman studied her for a long moment afterward, nodding slowly, as if she recognized something in that answer she'd heard once before, from someone else, a long time ago. Later that evening, alone in her office with the city lights coming on outside her window, Vivian called her mother the way she did every Sunday without fail, rain or shine or 11-hour work week. Loretta answered warm and a little wounded, teasing that she'd thought her daughter had forgotten her, still slipping, out of habit, into the middle name she'd given her firstborn, the one that meant her father's daughter, in a language Harold's own grandmother had spoken, and Harold himself had let slip away somewhere between the first warehouse and the 40th deal. Vivian apologized for the late call, blamed a meeting that ran long, and promised, as always, that she'd call anyway. Her mother told her, the way she always did, that as long as Vivian was eating and taking care of herself, that was all that mattered, and when Vivian reminded her she was 34, not a little girl, Loretta only laughed and told her she'd always be one. Her younger sister Renata's voice came in over the line too, warm and teasing, pointing out that even all the way from Atlanta, their mother still wanted to know if she'd eaten. Vivian laughed a real laugh, the kind she didn't get to have often enough in a week full of investor meetings and supply chain fires, and asked how the hospital was treating her sister. Renata admitted it kept her busier than she'd like, and that Adrian was buried in exam prep as usual. Vivian told her to pass along how proud she was of all of them, and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the meeting she just walked out of. Have you ever built something entirely on your own, with no help from the family member everyone assumed would inherit everything? Tell me in the comments, I want to hear your story. Back in Atlanta, Harold hadn't slept properly in 4 days. He asked his assistant to bring in his finance director first thing that morning, and by 9 o'clock, Emmanuel was sitting across from him with the door closed. Harold asked for a complete review of every transaction on Julian's executive account over the last 3 months, and asked that it be handled quietly, no whispers through the building, no one looking at his son like he was irresponsible before the truth was actually known. Whatever was happening, he said, needed to stay between the two of them. Emmanuel agreed to investigate personally and report to no one else, and Harold told him to bring back everything and to leave nothing out. Once Emmanuel left, Harold sat alone in his office a long moment, hands folded on his desk the way they'd been folded through every hard decision of the last 3 decades. For the first time in years, doubt had found its way into a father's heart, and he didn't yet know what to do with it. He thought, unbidden, about Vivian, the daughter he hadn't called in 3 weeks, whose meetings and milestones he only ever heard about secondhand, filtered through Loretta, always a beat too late to feel like he'd actually been there for any of it. He pushed the thought away. There would be time for that later. Right now, there was a company to protect. That evening at dinner, Julian mentioned in passing that he'd be at the club again that weekend, And Harold caught himself running the same silent calculation he always did, weighing whether saying something was worth the argument it would start and, as always, deciding it wasn't. Loretta caught his eye across the table. She didn't say anything either, but something in her expression told Harold she'd been running that same calculation for years longer than he had, and had simply run out of hope that saying something would ever change the outcome. A week later, Emmanuel came to Harold's office before 6 in the morning, before anyone else in the building had arrived, carrying a folder thick enough that Harold felt his stomach drop before a single page was opened. Emmanuel walked him through it category by category, and each number landed heavier than the last luxury hotel bookings: $48,000, designer clothing, $42,000, VIP club reservations nearly every weekend, $38,000, jewelry and watches, $56,000, personal imports and electronics, $37,000, cash withdrawals and miscellaneous spending, $40,000 more. Harold's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper, asking for the total, $261,000 in 3 months. Harold sat back slowly, the number landing on him the way a physical weight would. 32 years of sweat, 32 years of sacrifice, and in 3 months his son had come closer than Harold wanted to admit to unraveling a meaningful piece of it. He thought about the warehouse lease he'd nearly lost in year 1. He thought about the clients he'd personally driven across 3 states to keep, the Christmases he'd worked through because a shipment couldn't wait, the version of himself who used to know the price of everything down to the penny, because there had been a time when a single wrong penny meant the difference between making payroll and not. He didn't recognize the son sitting across from that math. He wondered, with a discomfort that went all the way to his stomach, whether Julian had ever once had to know what any of it actually cost, and whether that was Julian's failure or his own. Emmanuel spoke carefully, reminding Harold that years earlier he'd warned him not to overlook the children who'd stood by him just to chase the son he'd always wanted that a good name, he'd said then, was built on character, not on sons. Harold reminded him this was his family, his decision to make. Emmanuel only answered that he shouldn't be surprised then, when regret became part of that decision too. Harold didn't have a response for that yet. Instead, he told Emmanuel to review every transaction going back 6 months, every withdrawal, every approval, and that effective immediately, no money would leave the company without his written approval, not even Julian's. If you were Harold, would you have confronted Julian immediately, or waited until you had every piece of proof in hand first? Tell me what you'd have done. I'm genuinely curious how split the comments are going to be on this one. Harold didn't confront Julian that week. He told himself it was strategy that a man in Julian's position needed to be handled carefully, not cornered, or he'd dig in out of pride instead of owning what he'd done. The truth, if Harold had let himself sit with it, was closer to fear. Fear of what it would mean about the last 28 years if the son he'd spent them building up turned out to be someone who couldn't be trusted with what he'd been given. Julian, for his part, noticed nothing had changed on the surface. His card still worked at the restaurants he liked. His access to the building was untouched, and mistook his father's silence for forgiveness rather than what it actually was. A father quietly gathering the courage to face what he'd built. It was Loretta who finally said what Harold hadn't been able to. Watching him stare at the same folder he'd been staring at for a week, she told him plainly that he'd been distant with Julian and distant with himself both, and asked which one he was actually avoiding. Harold admitted, in the most honest sentence he'd said out loud in months, that he didn't know anymore, that he kept thinking about Vivian, about how easy it had been to give Julian everything, and never once wonder if she needed anything from him too. He told himself she didn't need it, that she was strong, that she'd figure it out, and he'd never once asked himself whether that was a fair thing to expect of a child. Loretta answered gently that Vivian had built an entire company without him ever asking that question, and told him to imagine what she might have built if he had. When Harold, quiet for a long moment, finally asked whether she resented him for raising their children so differently, Loretta didn't soften the answer. She told him she used to, that she'd watched him show up for every one of Julian's milestones and only half of theirs, and told herself for years it would even out eventually, that he'd notice on his own. She'd stopped waiting for that a long time ago, she said. She'd simply started making sure the girls knew they didn't need his noticing to be worth something. Harold said that was harder to hear than the audit had been. Loretta told him it was supposed to be that the audit was only about money, and this was about something no check, however large, could buy back. If you know a Vivian in your own family, the one who never got asked if she needed help, Because everyone just assumed she was fine, this one's for her. So drop a like in her honor. Vivian's next call to her mother carried news she'd been sitting on for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. Everything was ready, she told Loretta, flights booked, visas through, a place set up for both her and Renata. She wanted them there with her. Loretta's voice cracked with joy on the line, telling her daughter the timing couldn't have been better, that she'd already decided to take real time away from work to finally rest properly. In the background, Renata's voice rang out, delighted, announcing to no one in particular that they were going to New York, and Loretta laughed the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere very old and very tired and very grateful all at once, saying that after everything they'd been through, God had finally remembered them. Vivian told her mother quietly that she'd given them everything all these years. Now it was her turn to give something back. Loretta went quiet for a moment, then asked, in a way that wasn't really a question, whether Vivian's father knew yet. Vivian admitted he didn't. Her mother told her she didn't have to tell him. Vivian looked out at the skyline from her office window, the lights just coming on across the city she'd built her entire adult life inside of, mostly alone, and admitted that was what bothered her most, that not telling him didn't even feel like a decision anymore. It just felt like how things were between them now. Loretta didn't try to talk her out of the feeling or smooth it over the way she might have years earlier. She let the silence sit a moment, honest and a little sad, before moving on to something lighter, the way mothers sometimes do once a hard truth has finally been said out loud and doesn't need anything added to it. Vivian never called her father to tell him about the trip. It didn't occur to her that he'd want to know, and if she was honest with herself, some part of her wasn't sure she wanted him to. Would you have told your father, even knowing he might not have shown up the same way he always showed up for the sibling he favored? Let me know what you'd have done in the comments. Loretta and Renata landed on a bright, cold morning, and Vivian was waiting at arrivals with a driver and a bouquet too large for the occasion, because she'd spent 11 years imagining exactly this moment and had no intention of underplaying it now that it was finally real. Loretta cupped her daughter's face the way she had when Vivian was small enough to be picked up, telling her, through tears, that God had truly remembered them. Vivian told her gently that today wasn't for crying, today was for happiness. They spent the week the way Vivian had promised: museums, skylines, restaurants where nobody checked a price before ordering, because for once in her life, Loretta was allowed to simply enjoy something without calculating whether it was worth the cost. In one boutique, Loretta murmured, out of a lifetime's habit, that the clothes must cost a fortune, and Vivian only smiled and told her that today wasn't for checking prices. Today was for choosing whatever made her happy. Renata laughed and announced to the whole store that they were spending Big Sis's money today, and for once, nobody in that family did the math out loud. That night over dinner, while Loretta was distracted, admiring the view from the restaurant window, Renata pulled Vivian aside and asked, quietly, what she planned to tell their father when he eventually found out about the trip, and asked why he hadn't been invited. Vivian said she didn't plan to tell him anything that he'd never once asked to be included in the 11 years before this trip, and she didn't owe him an explanation for missing one more week on top of that. Renata told her gently that she wasn't suggesting Vivian owed him anything. She said she just suspected, underneath it all, that some part of her sister was still hoping he'd notice on his own, without needing to be told, and that she didn't know if their father was the kind of man who noticed anything unless somebody handed it to him directly. Vivian didn't answer right away. She'd spent 11 years telling herself she'd stopped waiting for her father's attention, and her sister's observation landed closer to true than she wanted to admit out loud. On the last full day, Vivian brought them to her office, the whole floor, the view, her name on the door, and watched her mother go quiet in a way she'd never seen before, staring around the space like she couldn't quite believe it belonged to her own daughter. Vivian told her they were building something even bigger than what she could see, expanding into Africa, creating jobs, building something that carried them back home to where she and Harold had both come from. Loretta, tears in her voice that had nothing to do with sadness, said that Harold had always wanted a son to build an empire, and that God had chosen his daughter instead. Vivian told her that everything she was today, she'd become because her mother never once gave up on her, and that she wished the people who still believed daughters couldn't build something like this could see it now. Type, she did it herself if you think Vivian built something more meaningful without her father's help than Julian ever will with all of it. I want to see how many of you agree. Back in Atlanta, the confrontation Harold had been avoiding finally arrived on its own, the way most things a person avoids eventually do. Julian had heard, through channels Harold never traced, that his card had been quietly restricted for 2 weeks. He locked himself in his room that Friday and didn't come out, didn't eat, didn't answer the door. Loretta's sister called Harold from the house, since Loretta herself was still in New York, telling him Julian wasn't speaking, hadn't eaten since the day before. Harold drove over immediately, standing outside his son's door, pleading with him to open it, telling him not to punish himself further no matter how angry he was. When Julian finally spoke, his voice was raw in a way Harold hadn't heard since his son was a teenager. He demanded to know where all this patience had been when Harold humiliated him over $31,000, shouted at him like a stranger, called him irresponsible, made him feel like he meant nothing. He told his father to go back to protecting his money and leave him alone. Harold stood at that door a long time, unable to walk away, unable to find words that would actually reach his son, instead of just placating him one more time the way he'd been placating him for 28 years. Through the door, he could hear Julian pacing, the particular rhythm of a young man who had never once had to sit with a consequence long enough to actually learn anything from it. The old script arrived before Harold could stop it. He heard himself offering to take Julian shopping the next day, any brand he wanted, even the sports car he'd been asking about, anything, if he'd just opened the door. Even as the words left him, some new and unwelcome part of Harold recognized them for what they were. Not a fresh offer, but the same offer he'd been making in one form or another since Julian was 10 years old, dressed up in slightly larger numbers each time. Julian's voice came back bitter, asking if that was really all it took to solve this in his father's mind. When Harold asked what he meant, Julian reminded him that he always said things like that just yesterday, Harold had embarrassed him, made him feel small. Harold insisted that had never been his intention, that he'd only wanted his son to understand responsibility. Julian shot back, asking what responsibility even meant after the life Harold himself had let him live. Harold closed his eyes and admitted, through the door, that he'd been wrong to raise him the way he had, that Julian was still his son, that everything he'd built would still be his one day, and begged him, one more time, to come out. Harold told his son, through the door, that starting that month he'd put him on a fixed monthly allowance, $20,000. Julian's laugh was sharp and humorless. He said that wouldn't even cover his lifestyle. When Harold asked what would, Julian named $50,000, then, almost carelessly, doubled it to 100 maybe then, he said. He'd think about coming out. Down the hall, Loretta's sister watched Harold's shoulders sag in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with recognition. The recognition of a pattern he'd built with his own hands over decades, one concession at a time, until his son had learned that closing a door was the fastest way to open his father's wallet. It hadn't started with $100,000. It had started small, the way these things always do, a 10-year-old Julian sulking over a canceled trip to the amusement park, and Harold, guilty over a mispromise, buying him a bicycle instead to smooth it over. A 16-year-old Julian failing a class, and Harold hiring a tutor and never once asking why the effort hadn't been there in the first place. Every disappointment absorbed and converted into a gift, until Julian had learned, without either of them ever naming it out loud, that consequences in the Bennett house were a thing that happened to other people's children. Harold remembered, too, the one time Vivian had come to him at 16, asking for help with a car so she could take a part-time job after school, and how he'd told her to figure it out herself, that a little hardship built character. He'd meant it as a lesson. Looking back now, he could see it for what it actually was, the same door slammed twice, once on each child, but only one of them had been handed a bicycle to make up for it. He murmured to himself, more than to anyone listening, that Julian would calm down, that he just needed time. But even as he said it, some new and unwelcome part of him, the part that had spent a week staring at a folder full of numbers, the part that had listened to his wife ask him a question, he still didn't have a real answer to recognize the sentence for what it actually was. Not comfort, surrender dressed up as patience. He thought of Vivian again, standing in an office she'd built entirely without him, an ocean and a lifetime of assumptions away, and for the first time in 28 years, Harold Bennett asked himself a question he was afraid of the answer. To what had he actually taught either one of his children, and which one of them had learned the lesson he'd meant to teach? Comment in nabbling if you think Harold just made things worse instead of better, and comment "give him time" if you think a father's patience deserves more credit than the internet usually gives it. I want both sides in the comments. Julian came out of that room that night, exactly as Harold had known he would, and the household exhaled the way it always did when the crisis passed, but something in Harold hadn't exhaled with it. He sat alone on the back porch long after everyone else had gone to bed, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he let himself think honestly about all four of his children, instead of just the one who had always taken up the most space in the room. He thought about report cards he'd never looked at closely, recitals he'd shown up late for or missed entirely, birthdays where Julian got the gift he'd asked for, and the girls got whatever was convenient. He thought about the way Vivian had built an entire company without once asking him for anything, and how he'd let himself believe that meant she didn't need him, instead of recognizing it for what it actually was. A daughter who had simply stopped expecting him to show up and build her life around that absence instead of waiting for it to change. He thought about Adrian, barely into her 20s, calling home every night during finals week, not because she needed anything, but because she'd learned young that calling home meant talking to her mother and had simply stopped expecting her father to be the one who picked up. He thought about Renata's white coat ceremony, the one he'd attended for exactly 40 minutes before excusing himself for a call that, in hindsight, could easily have waited a day. He'd told himself at the time that he was proud of her. He couldn't remember if he'd actually said it out loud or just assumed she already knew. If only he had treated all of them the same, he thought, the realization arriving late and heavy, the way true things often do when a person has spent decades avoiding them. Maybe one of his daughters would already be running this company and doing it better than his son ever could. He called Vivian the next morning, the first call he'd initiated to her and longer than either of them wanted to count. He stared at her number on his phone for a full 10 minutes before he finally pressed call, unsure if he had any right to expect her to pick up. She answered with genuine surprise in her voice, asking if everything was all right. He told her everything was fine, that he'd simply wanted to hear how things were really going, not the version her mother told him secondhand. There was a pause on the line long enough that Harold wondered if he'd waited too long to ask. Then Vivian started talking, and for the first time in years, her father actually listened all the way through. Harold flew to New York himself 2 weeks later, no assistant, no announcement, just a father showing up somewhere his daughter had already built something worth showing up for. He stood in the doorway of her office the way she'd once imagined he might, years ago, before she'd stopped imagining it at all, and watched her run a meeting with the same steady confidence he recognized from his own younger self. The version of himself from before 32 years of success had made him careless with the people who mattered most. The office itself told him things he hadn't let himself learn secondhand. A wall of framed shipping manifests from her very first contracts, kept not for decoration, but the way a person keeps proof of something they once weren't sure they'd survive. A small photograph on her desk of Loretta and Renata from their trip, prominently placed, no photograph of him anywhere in the room, which told him something too, and he made himself sit with that instead of looking away from it. She caught sight of him and dismissed the room gently, professionally, without missing a step, asking what he was doing there. Harold told her he'd come to see what she'd built and to ask her something he should have asked years ago. He told her that Bennett Industries needed someone who actually understood what it cost to build it, someone who knew that money didn't refill itself on its own. He'd spent 32 years assuming that person would be Julian, because Julian was the one he'd decided to believe in without ever making him earn it. He admitted he'd been wrong and that some part of him had always known it. Vivian didn't answer right away. 11 years of being overlooked didn't dissolve in a single apology, however sincere, and she wasn't about to pretend otherwise just because her father had finally shown up. Reading the hesitation on her face correctly, Harold told her he wasn't offering her the company as a consolation prize for every year he hadn't called. He was asking because she'd already proven she was better at this than he'd ever given her credit for, and he'd be a fool to let pride keep him from saying so out loud. Vivian reminded him she'd spent 11 years building something with her own name on it, not his. If she took this, she told him, she wasn't folding her company into a footnote of Bennett Industries. Whatever it looked like, it had to be a real partnership, not an inheritance he was finally getting around to handing over. Harold told her that was fair, and meant it in a way that surprised even him. The old Harold would have bristled at being told terms by anyone, let alone a daughter he'd spent years assuming would simply be grateful for whatever he offered. He asked her to tell him what that partnership looked like to her, and promised to listen all the way through this time. She asked, finally, about Julian. Harold told her Julian was going to have to learn what responsibility actually meant, the hard way, the way Harold himself should have taught him from the start, instead of writing checks every time he closed a door. That wasn't her problem to fix, he said. It was his, and it was overdue. Type second chance if you think Vivian should take the offer, and type too little too late if you think 11 years of being overlooked doesn't get fixed with one apology. I want to see which side wins. Vivian didn't say yes that day. She told her father she'd think about it, and she meant it not as a delay tactic, but as the honest answer of a woman who had learned the hard way not to reorganize her life around a promise until she'd watched it hold. 6 months later, Bennett Industries announced its expansion into African markets. Co-led by Vivian Bennett out of a newly opened Atlanta office, she split her time between and the New York headquarters of the company that still bore her own name on the door. Harold didn't take credit for the idea in a single interview. He made sure of that personally. Julian took the $20,000 allowance for exactly 4 months before he asked his father, for the first time in his life, for a job instead of a check, an entry-level supply chain position, no title, no corner office, the same starting point every other new hire got. Harold said yes before Julian finished asking, and didn't offer him anything more than that. It wasn't an easy adjustment. He almost quit in week 3, when a supervisor who had no idea whose son he was corrected him in front of the whole floor for a shipping error any new hire might have made, and for the first time in his life, nobody stepped in to soften it or explain it away. Julian showed up late twice in his first month, and got the same write-up any other new employee would have received, no exceptions carved out for the family name on the building. He complained about it to his mother that night, expecting the old sympathy, the old smoothing over, and Loretta, gently but firmly, told him he was exactly where he needed to be. By month 6, the write-ups had stopped. By month 8, his supervisor recommended him for a small project lead role, without knowing or caring whose son he was, and Julian carried that particular piece of paper around in his jacket pocket for a week before he could bring himself to throw it away instead of framing it. At Renata's hospital fundraiser gala that spring, all 4 Bennett children stood together in the same photograph for the first time in over a decade. Adrian freshly barred and already arguing her first real case, Renata still in scrubs because she'd come straight from a 12-hour shift, Julian a little quieter than anyone remembered him being, and Vivian, finally, standing exactly where she'd always belonged. Harold made a point that night of asking Adrian about her case, not the polite, half-listening question he might have asked a decade earlier, but real questions, the kind that required him to actually follow her answers. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. And when the photograph was taken, she stood a little closer to her father than she might have a year before. Loretta watched the photograph being taken and thought, not for the first time, that God had a way of writing the final chapter of a story no one else believed was still being written. A father can spend 32 years building an empire and still take decades to see which of his children actually understood what it cost. It's never too late to look clearly, but the child who was overlooked doesn't owe you gratitude for finally noticing. She only owes herself the life she already built without you. If this story hit close to home, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me honestly in the comments, were you the Julian in your family? Or were you the Vivian? I'll read every single answer.